So I would argue to you that that stereotypes are negative, and that they even the good ones are bad because they're not true, and you apply them to people. So got a little disturbed there. So I hate that people knock on the door and then go away. What are cultural values? And then I've got several things on cultural values in here, dealing with attitudes, about time, about beliefs, about other people, about customs, and a value orientation continuum. This is why stereotypes don't work. There are certain groups that many of them are a certain way in their society, but not everyone. Not every American is very picky and always got the right time planned out, etc. So, for instance, they're not always on time. We like to think as Americans, if I gave a generalization, which is what I use in place of stereotype, I'd say, well, we like to be on time. And that's not true. There's some people, like certain relatives of mine, that they'll never show up on time. Never. It's not going to happen. So they would be the exception to the rule. And other ones deal with individualism and collectivism. We think of some cultures as everybody kind of is the same way in that culture because they're very into the group thing. And I won't even name those cultures because I don't even want to hint at a stereotype. But they think that culture Z, everybody likes, everybody in culture Z likes electronics, and they're all hooked into the wire. They're all wired in, they're all into gaming and stuff like that, cell phones. And that may not be true. There are individuals in some cultures. Some cultures actually say they prize being a rugged individualist, but in practice, most of them are in a herd and they all do the same thing. So that's always kind of funny, you know. We're all rugged individualists. And then please say after me and everybody in the crowd, we believe in the individual. I said, well, you're all saying the same thing at the same time, so it's not really true. Other things are power distance, and power distance is interesting. It deals with, a lot of times in our reference, we say that the mayor of the town is not a dictator. He's just a little, you know, he has a little more power than I do, but I could go talk to him. I don't have to be in awe of him or fearful of him. Same could be the attitude toward the president or the governor. But in some cultures, the leader is so far above you that you would never even go and talk to them because you're nobody. You can't talk to them. And sometimes in cultures, the leaders become so distant from, maybe it didn't start out that way, but they become so distant that the society begins to break down. I'll give an example. The king of Spain in the 1400s. Kings were ruled by divine right of God, you know. So if you even question the orders of the king, would be absolute heresy. I mean, it would be like heresy. It was like a religion, and the king ruled because somebody said, well, he's up there because he's in power. So I think it's very important to all these things to be looked at in each culture. Hold on a second. Other values in cultures deal with explanations for stuff. Some cultures believe everything can be explained, very logical. Other cultures believe that it's mysterious and mystical, and that could be where they come from. We could call it superstitious, but whatever we want to call it, it's what they believe. Man and nature. If there's an earthquake, do you believe it's some unhappy God did it, or it's just chance? Or do you believe that maybe we caused the earthquake? The climate change, global warming. There's a big argument about that. Does it exist? And if it does exist, what's causing it? Many people say scientifically they know it's caused by mankind, but that's really interesting. How do how do you know? Low context, high context, very interesting. Um, I would say generally, as I think about Americans, we believe that there are signs to tell us what to do and where to go and where the highway goes, etc. And that mostly in our culture, we think that there are clear signs so even an idiot can figure out what they need to do, you know. But in some cultures, there are no signs, and particularly in relationships, you don't know what to do. You don't know whether to approach people. You don't know whether looking in the face and staring them in the eye is offensive. You don't know whether to shake hands. And those cultures that you get lost in, you have no idea about, we call those high context. In other words, high context means you really have to know the culture in order to function in those. Now, I would assume that probably if I went to Europe, I could probably observe through signs and other things. I could figure out a lot of the rules, especially about movement and getting on subways and things like that. It's just a matter of understanding the system. But maybe if you wanted to go on a date and you wanted to ask somebody out for a date and you didn't know the rules of that culture, you'd just be lost because it's very high context. It wouldn't at all be the formal thing that it is here. I know in Spain, young people often go out in groups. And the idea of going on a date per se that I grew up with back in the 70s, that they just don't do that. Large groups of people go out with large groups of people, and eventually they develop a relationship and they get married and stuff. But you just go with your friends and you go around to different bars and stuff in Madrid, and that's how they act. That's how young people get together. There's none of this pressure of one-on-one of the date and all this stuff that I grew up with. We don't have that. So it's real family oriented. It's totally different. I could get into more, darker parts of culture, relationships and stuff, and all kinds of male-female relationships. That can be very complicated. And we think it's complicated in our culture, but imagine if you had to figure out the rules in another culture. Some cultures have arranged marriages. I mean, I never could conceive of that. I had a student once, very upper class. Her father was an ambassador from India to Australia. And she had an arranged marriage. She was from India. And I just said, I don't understand this. How could this be? Don't you want to marry for love? He said, it's fine. She's very fine with it. And I never understood it. Never understood it at all. Also, I go in polychronic and monochronic time. I mentioned time before about being late, but also those people say you can multitask. So I don't really believe in that. I think that's nonsense. You can only do one thing at a time. You can't multitask. And I think it drives us crazy to claim that I can do 4 things at once and keep spinning them or keeping those dishes. Used to be a guy on TV years ago. It would spin plates on a stick. And that was the show. They would actually be on the Ed Sullivan Show, and people would say, it's incredible. A plate spinner. Now, if somebody did that, you'd say, fine, but I'm not going to pay money to watch somebody do that. It's just boring. Okay, we demand people do much more dramatic things. Time also in terms of future, past, and present. Some people live for the present. Some cultures we assume put the most value in what's happening now, that the idea of the future or distant future, building up money to buy a house 20 years from now or something and planning it out. Some cultures think that's futile. They don't even conceptually don't grasp that. Why would you, in some cultures, look back on the past and put great emphasis on traditions, And I think Americans, we kind of look to the near future, but not too far. If it's over 5 years away, it's might as well be 1,000 years away. So orientations like this impact how we live our lives. None of us follow a pattern exactly like others in American culture. Wouldn't expect it. The same in other groups. So it's very important that when you look at these different values, whether it's toward nature or the use of time, look at the future, your activities. I always think in Nebraska that people are very much into activities. When I talk to people, what do you do for a job? We always ask that. What do you do for a job? And what kind of activities are your kids in? They're into sports, or they're into, I don't know, book clubs. Occasionally that happens. But we're into activities, and we see our lives dominated, our time dominated by when we're going to be here and what we're going to be there and how we're going to get the kids to the soccer game, etc. All very interesting things. I'm going to stop this now. I hope I didn't lose the video. Otherwise, I'll have to do this again. You don't want to watch this again.